Section 2 of this chapter is very short and contains a lot of factual information, like I was saying before. So I'm going to, for the most part, leave it for you to read, but I'll just talk kind of generally about the rationale for some of these concepts. And really what we're talking about here is competitiveness in a global economy. Around the late 80s, there were concerns in the United States over what's called the trade deficit. And this is the value of imports minus the value of exports, or vice versa, I think. So what we were finding is that we were importing a lot more than we were exporting, and people were concerned about that. And so one of the solutions that was proposed is to allow firms, U.S. firms, to cooperate so that they could face the threat of foreign competition more easily. And in particular, a lot of the cooperation is centered around R&D, research and development. And so a number of laws were passed, and also various arrangements were made to facilitate cooperation among rivals in the area of R&D. Now, it's possible that this could lead to some anti-competitive results. Because first of all, if the firms come together and maybe they say they're going to talk about R&D, it's possible that the conversation would turn to discussing prices, right, and price fixing. So having a format for them to meet might lead to price fixing. But even if it doesn't, they might agree to stop investing in R&D. Say, look, let's slow down, right? Because in addition to competing over prices, firms also compete over quality, right? And R&D is one of the important ways that you can develop a more higher quality product. And so they might say, look, let's slow down the amount of R&D that we invest in, because we're eating up our profits with our R&D investment. So that's another concern. But their justification is that we need to compete with all these foreign firms, and these foreign firms are cooperating, so we need to pool our resources together. And so, for example, one of these agreements is called the International Competition Policy Advisory Committee. And this was formed in the Department of Justice in 1997 for the reasons that I mentioned. And so joint ventures are cooperative arrangements between firms that otherwise would violate antitrust laws. So again, you should read this section and highlight just the different types of organizations that were formed. One is also relevant to Silicon Valley economy, and this is the International Symantec Manufacturing Initiative that originally was developed to facilitate conversations relating to semiconductors, and since has grown into covering more industries. I think the most interesting part of this section is the case in point article, and it describes the differences in antitrust policy in the US and the European Union. So in the last section I mentioned, we call these laws that we're referring to as antitrust laws. And it's a bit of a strange name. The reason, again, is because we used to have these large organizations called trusts, and so the name kind of stuck. In Europe, they call it competition policy. But it's not just the difference in names that matters. It's also the difference in the laws. And many economists and others who have observed these differences say the following. US antitrust laws are designed to help the consumer, right, to keep prices low, to be pro-competition. But European antitrust laws are designed to help the firms. And so some of the laws, in fact, raise prices, keep prices high for consumers, but keep companies in business. And which is correct? Well, Americans tend to think that antitrust laws should be pro-consumer, but perhaps there's some justification that we need to keep the jobs here, and so therefore we need to protect the companies, the competitors. So in other words, is the antitrust pro-competition or pro-competitor? This is one way to think about the differences between the antitrust laws in both cases. And in fact, we see that, although I mentioned a moment ago, Microsoft essentially got off the hook in the United States. There at one time, there was a threat that they were going to be broken up into two companies, but that was reversed, and it was by a higher court, and eventually they got off with some pretty minor consequences. They had to stop, for example, requiring computer manufacturers to put Explorer on the desktop and things like that. So in other words, these are various conduct remedies. In other words, there were some their activities regarding what they could do were regulated, but they were pretty minor. Whereas in the European Union, they had to pay a $1 billion+ fine. And so sometimes actions that take place in Europe also affect what we see here in the United States. Another thing that the European decision concerning Microsoft did is require them to reveal all of the, basically, how their operating system works to anybody who wants to develop applications for it, so that people could write applications for Windows, which obviously is the dominant operating system. And so that was brought about by the European courts, not the US courts.